The broadcast was still running when the ships came through. That detail mattered more than anyone understood at the time. Not the ships themselves, not the geometry of them, which was wrong in ways that made the eye slide off the edges like water off glass, but the fact that the cameras were already on. 43 million people watching. The kind of number that only happens twice a year, when everything else in the country pauses and everyone, everywhere, agrees without discussion to stop and look at the same thing. The Valdhari commanders would later describe their choice of timing as mathematically optimal. They had studied human civilization for 11 months. They understood population density, infrastructure vulnerability, communications architecture, military response windows. They knew that on this particular Sunday afternoon, approximately 68,000 human beings would be physically concentrated in a single open-air structure in the industrial Midwest of North America, surrounded by thousands more in adjacent areas, with a significant portion of the remaining population stationary and distracted before screens. They had calculated the psychological impact of appearing first above a civilian gathering rather than a military installation. The message was intended to be unmistakable. We choose where this begins. We choose the terms. You are already surrounded by your own helplessness. It was a good plan. It was, by any rational metric, a nearly perfect opening move. They just hadn't understood what they were watching for 11 months. Marcus Webb had been selling beer for 12 years. That sounds like a small fact. It wasn't. It was the kind of fact that contained everything important about him. The early mornings loading the coolers, the specific angle you had to hold a cup to pour fast without losing the head, the way you learned to read a crowd's mood by the third quarter, the way you stopped noticing the noise the same way you stopped noticing your own heartbeat. He was 41 years old, built like someone who had been large once, and was now just solid, with a scar along his left forearm from a forklift accident 8 years ago that he'd never quite explained correctly to the workers' comp people. He had 2 daughters. He was behind on his oldest one's college fund. He wore a yellow vendor's vest, and he had never once in his life thought of himself as the kind of person history remembered. He was on the ramp between sections 114 and 115 when the light changed. That was how he'd describe it later, in the recordings that would be listened to by beings he couldn't have imagined. The light changed. It wasn't dark, exactly. It was more like the sun had been replaced by something that agreed to approximate the sun, but didn't quite understand warmth. The shadows went wrong. The grass on the field below went a color that didn't have a name in English. And then the noise, not from the crowd hadn't made a sound yet, but from above, a frequency that wasn't quite sound and wasn't quite pressure but was both, settling into the chest cavity like something deciding to live there. Marcus looked up. Everyone looked up. The ship was large enough that for a moment his brain categorized it as weather. Then it categorized it as a building that had somehow gotten into the sky. Then it stopped categorizing it and just registered the fact of it the way you register a car accident, not with processing, but with pure, pre-linguistic presence. It was not alone. 2 more sat at angles above the stadium's north end, further up, in a formation that was clearly deliberate. Behind the ridgeline of the upper deck, more light shifts suggested others. The crowd of 68,000 people, most of whom had been on their feet for a third-quarter drive that had the home team within 4 points with 6 minutes left, were now uniformly still and uniformly silent in a way that had no precedent in Marcus's 12 years of working this stadium. He would later say the silence lasted about 4 seconds. He was wrong. The Valdhari's own recordings confirmed it lasted 11 seconds of absolute, unbroken human silence. And then the crowd roared. Sector Commander Veth Ashar had experienced 41 planetary subjugations over a career spanning what humans would calculate as roughly 2 centuries. She had seen panic. She had seen paralysis. She had seen the specific, desperate scramble of a species that understood, in one terrible collective moment, that something larger than itself had arrived with intentions. She had a precise, empirically refined model for how it progressed. Silence, then screaming, then stampede, then the collapse of social structure that made everything that followed significantly easier to manage. 11 seconds of silence. She recognized that part. And then the sound hit her monitors and she stopped. It was not screaming. It was not the fractal dissolution of a crowd breaking apart. It was unified. It was rhythmic. It had structure. Her audio analysis systems required 0.3 seconds to parse it and then returned a result she read twice because the translation seemed wrong. The crowd was chanting. They were chanting the name of their sports team. Veth Ashar turned to her secondary analyst, a younger officer named Prane who had been assigned to human behavioral studies specifically because of a talent for pattern recognition. "Explain," she said. Prane did not immediately explain. This was unusual. Prane was not someone who hesitated. "The chanting isn't distress vocalization," Prane said finally. "It matches exactly amplitude, rhythm, grouping. It matches recordings from earlier in the event. They're reproducing a previous social behavior in response to us. Why? I don't know. Is it aggression?" Prane was quiet for another moment. "The hormone profile from our atmospheric samplers isn't consistent with aggression. It's consistent with," another pause longer. "It's consistent with the profile we recorded earlier before our arrival, when the home team scored." Veth Ashar looked at the feed from the stadium. 68,000 humans standing, facing upward toward her ships, making coordinated noise in a pattern associated with celebration or encouragement in the context of a game that they were no longer playing. "They think we're part of the game," one of her junior officers offered. "No," said Prane slowly. "They know we're not. The atmospheric cortisol is elevated. They know." "Then what are they doing?" Prane didn't answer that. She would think about it for a long time afterward. The first answer that came to her was the one she discarded immediately because it seemed too strange. She discarded it because it implied something about the human species that her models had not prepared her for. She discarded it and wrote a different answer in her report and carried the real one alone for almost a year before she said it out loud. They were refusing. Not refusing to acknowledge the ships, not refusing to understand what was happening, refusing to respond the way a species was supposed to respond, refusing to hand over the beginning of the encounter on the terms it had been offered. They were in the middle of something with stakes, something that mattered, and 68,000 of them had collectively, without discussion, without coordination, decided that the correct answer to an alien invasion fleet was to keep being who they were for as long as they possibly could. It cost the Valdhari 40 seconds. 40 seconds in which they recalibrated their psychological impact models because the first ones had already returned errors. 40 seconds in which Veth Ashar, who had overseen 41 subjugations, encountered a result her experience had not produced before. 40 seconds doesn't sound like much. It was, because those 40 seconds were broadcast live to 43 million people. And 43 million people watched 68,000 of their own choose noise over silence, presence over panic, collective identity over individual terror. And something happened in those 43 million nervous systems that the Valdhari would spend a very long time trying to quantify and never quite succeed. Marcus hadn't started chanting. He wanted to be honest about that later. He hadn't made a decision. His mouth had opened, and the sound had come out because it was the sound that was already in the air, the sound the stadium had been making all afternoon, the sound that was baked into the space itself after 12 years of the same Sunday rhythms. He wasn't brave. He'd use this word carefully, habituated. His body knew what to do in this stadium, and it did it while his mind was still processing the impossible geometry of what was in the sky. But here is the thing about habit. It is not the same as mindlessness. Because about 30 seconds into the chanting, Marcus Webb became fully aware of what he was doing and why it was strange and what the thing in the sky was, and he kept doing it anyway. That was the decision. The quiet one. The one that looked like nothing from the outside. He kept doing it anyway. 3 sections down, a woman named Deja Patterson, 34, wore her son's jersey, had driven 4 hours for this game, was on her phone. She was live streaming, which was not heroic, but she was also explaining what she was seeing in real time in a voice that was controlled with the specific effort of someone who was using control as a survival mechanism. Okay, so those are definitely not human. Those are ships. Those are actually okay, people. Those are ships, and everybody is still here. Nobody's leaving. I'm not leaving. We're all still here. I don't know what's going to happen, but we are here, okay? We are here. Her stream was being watched by 400,000 people within 6 minutes. The Valdhari's information monitoring systems flagged it. Prane read the transcript. She read it 3 times. Then she sent a priority message up her chain of command that said, in essence, "This is not how species behave during first contact subjugation events. I recommend we pause the Phase 2 timeline until I understand what is happening." The message was acknowledged and filed. The Phase 2 timeline was not paused. The broadcast team had stayed on air. This also mattered. This mattered enormously, and the Valdhari understood it only much later. The production truck outside the stadium had a crew of 11 people who were, by any objective measure, among the most frightened human beings on the planet in that moment. They could see the ships directly. They were outside the protective illusion of the crowd. They had no 68,000 voices to be part of. They were 11 people in a metal box with equipment they understood and a situation they did not. The director's name was Carl Hubbard. He was 53. He had covered 3 Super Bowls, a hurricane, and a presidential assassination attempt. He had never covered anything like this. He kept the cameras on. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't make a decision exactly the way Marcus hadn't made a decision. He just didn't stop. He kept doing his job because stopping felt, in some way he couldn't articulate, like it would be the thing that made it real. Like the cameras being on was a way of insisting that this was still something that could be covered, that was still within the domain of human events, that hadn't yet become something else entirely. The broadcast reached 43 million people. 43 million people watched a football crowd refuse to leave. And then, and this is the part the Valdhari had not planned for, could not have planned for, something started moving through those 43 million people. Not panic. Not the evacuation behavior their models predicted. Something slower and stranger and in some ways more alarming. People started going toward the stadium. Not many. Not a wave. Individuals. A man from a sports bar 3 blocks away who'd been watching the game on a screen and walked outside when the light changed and saw the shadows and felt the pressure sound and then started walking, not running, walking toward the gates. A teenager from a neighborhood half a mile north who'd been on her roof watching and climbed down and got on her bike. Off-duty firefighters, nurses driving home, a bus driver who pulled his bus to the curb, turned off the engine, and got out and stood watching and then started walking toward the stadium, because the people in the stadium had made a sound he recognized as human, and he wanted to be near it. None of them could explain it afterward. Prane's models had no category for it. The Valdhari began Phase 2. The sound the suppression emitters made was not a sound, technically. It was a disruption of the electromagnetic field within a targeted radius that interfered with voluntary muscle control in species with certain neurological profiles. The Valdhari had used it on 11 different species. In 11 out of 11 cases, it produced immediate collapse, disorientation, and the rapid cessation of coordinated behavior, which psychologically devastated organized resistance before it could form. It hit the stadium. Marcus felt it as a sensation he would later describe as every muscle in his body simultaneously forgetting its job. He went to his knees. Around him, 47,000 people went to their knees. The other 21,000 were, for reasons the Valdhari would find deeply troubling later, still standing. 21,000 people were standing, not because they were resistant, not because of any biological advantage, because they'd grabbed things, railings, each other, the backs of seats. Because human beings in crowds, when something happens to their legs, reach out for the nearest solid thing without thinking about it. And in a stadium, there are railings every 12 feet, and 21,000 people happen to be within arm's reach of one when the emitters fired. The Valdhari hadn't accounted for the railings. Veth Ashar looked at her feed showing 21,000 humans clinging to stadium infrastructure with expressions of visible distress, but maintained upright posture, and she experienced something she would later describe to the Inquiry Commission as a sensation she had no word for. The closest translation her language offered was a concept meaning the wrongness of a thing that is technically possible but should not be. She had a word for things that defied physics. She had a word for things that defied probability. She did not have a word for things that defied expectation while being entirely physically explicable, and the gap in her vocabulary bothered her more than the 21,000 humans bothered her. More than bothered her, frightened her a little. And Veth Ashar was someone who had supervised 41 planetary subjugations. She did not frighten easily. She ordered the secondary emitter pulse. It hit harder. People dropped. The 21,000 lost their railings. Marcus hit the concrete floor of the ramp and lay there with his face against the cold surface and his body temporarily not his own, and he could hear the crowd around him, and they were still making noise. Not chanting now, but not screaming in the way the Valdhari expected. It was something else, something harder to describe. Groaning, yes, expressions of pain, but underneath it, through it, something collective. People calling out to each other, "You okay? I'm okay. You okay? I'm okay," over and over. The specific mundane ritual of humans checking on the humans near them. Not organized, not strategic, just reflexive, like breathing. Prain flagged this in her second priority message to the command chain. The species is experiencing significant physical distress. Their vocalizations are not consistent with demoralization. They are not calling for help. They are performing social maintenance with each other while incapacitated. I do not have a model for this behavior. I recommend we reevaluate. This message was also filed. Marcus couldn't move his legs. He understood this clearly and calmly. He'd been a large person his whole life, and his body had a history of malfunctions. The forklift, a torn rotator cuff, a kidney stone at 37 that he still considered the worst experience of his life. And he had a relationship with physical pain that was more negotiated than catastrophic. He lay on the concrete and breathed and inventoried the situation. Legs not responding. Arms partially responsive, head clear, not injured as far as he could tell, just switched off below the waist like a circuit breaker had tripped. He heard from somewhere below him, the concourse maybe or outside, a sound that wasn't crowd noise and wasn't the pressure frequency of the ships. It was mechanical. It was familiar. It took him a moment to place it, and when he did he thought he'd gotten it wrong. It was someone's radio, an old portable radio. Someone had brought an actual, battery-powered portable radio to the stadium, which almost no one did anymore, and it was playing the game broadcast, which was still running, which Carl Hubbard in the production truck had kept running, and the announcer's voice was coming out of it saying, in a voice that was visibly holding itself together, "We are asking everyone to remain calm. We don't know what we're looking at. We are going to stay on the air. We are going to stay on the air," Marcus laughed. He laughed lying face down on a stadium ramp with his legs disabled by alien technology under a fleet of ships that had come to subjugate the planet. He laughed because Carl Hubbard was still doing his job and someone had brought a portable radio, and the announcer was saying we are going to stay on the air like that was a thing that mattered. And it did matter. It mattered absolutely. And the gap between how absurd everything was and how much it mattered anyway it was funny. Not in a way Marcus could explain. Just funny in the way that certain things are funny when you're in enough pain and enough fear, and you've been human long enough to have a sense of humor about it. 3 people near him heard him laugh and laughed too. The Valdhari's atmospheric sensors recorded laughter. This was flagged automatically as an anomalous data point. No further action was taken because no one in the command chain had a framework for what to do with it. Deja Patterson hadn't been hit as hard by the second pulse. She was in a section with heavy concrete risers, and she'd rolled into the angle of one before the pulse fully discharged, which reduced her exposure. Her legs were weak but operational. She was also still streaming. She described later that she hadn't thought about stopping. The stream had become, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, the thing she was doing instead of panicking. As long as she was explaining, as long as she was reporting, she was in a role she understood, and the role she understood had behaviors associated with it, and the behaviors kept her moving. "Okay, a lot of people are down," she said into her phone, her voice barely above a whisper now, picking her way through the seated and prone bodies around her. "I see people helping each other up. I see there's a woman with a broken arm, I can see the break, and the guy next to her is using his jersey as a sling, and she's helping him do it with her other hand. She's helping him tie it, okay. People are starting to move again in my section. It's slow." The stream had 2 million viewers. The Valdhari were aware of the stream. They flagged it as a potential coordination mechanism and dispatched a localized disruptor to the signal. The signal dropped for 40 seconds and then came back on a different frequency because someone in the technical relay chain, an engineer named Ahmed Sowery working remotely from an apartment 6 states away, watching the stream on his personal phone while also monitoring the communications degradation, had rerouted it through a backup node in 11 seconds flat and didn't stop to wonder whether it was dangerous to do so. He just did it because the stream was running and it should keep running, and he knew how to make it keep running. Ahmed had never met Deja Patterson. He would meet her 9 months later at a ceremony that would also contain people he'd never met who'd also kept things running. He would find this unremarkable. He would find it exactly as remarkable as his own behavior, which was to say, not very. He'd just done the thing he knew how to do. That was all. That was all any of them did. The Valdhari could not find the bottom of it. The landing sequence began 40 minutes after first contact. By this point, the Valdhari's invasion timeline was already 17 minutes behind schedule due to the compounding anomalies in human behavioral response. This was unprecedented. Vetha Shar's record across 41 engagements included a maximum deviation of 4 minutes, and that had been atmospheric, not psychological. She did not include the deviation in her initial report to Fleet Command. She was not yet ready to explain it. The ground forces were designed for the urban density adjacent to the stadium. They descended in groups of 12, in units that had successfully processed 23 different planetary species through a subjugation protocol optimized over many decades. Visible overwhelming force, targeted immobilization of resistance nodes, rapid communication infrastructure seizure, psychological demonstration via the specific selection of high-visibility targets to process publicly, establishing authority through the visible helplessness of the local population. The unit that descended into the parking lot adjacent to the stadium's south gate encountered a tailgate party. This fact would later be discussed at length in the inquiry. Approximately 350 humans who had not been inside the stadium, who had been in the parking lot, gathered around portable grills and coolers and folding tables covered in food, watching the ships arrive on the screens of their phones and the small television sets some of them had brought on portable stands, who had watched the crowd inside the stadium refuse to run and had apparently decided that the correct response to this information was to stay where they were as well. 350 people in a parking lot in lawn chairs. The unit commander, a decorated Valdhari officer named Senvorath, descended with his 12 soldiers into this situation and experienced a pause that he would struggle to categorize in his report. The humans were not armed. They were not organized in a military sense. They were arranged in small groups of 8 to 15 around individual thermal cooking units, with food in various stages of preparation, and they were looking at the soldiers with expressions that Senvorath's training had taught him to identify as a complex mixture of fear, determination, and the word his translator offered was stubbornness, which seemed too small, and they were not moving. An elderly man near the center of the lot stood up from his chair and said something. The translator processed it. "You picked the wrong Sunday, pal." Senvorath had been briefed on human language. He understood the words. He did not understand why 70 of the 350 people laughed at this, visibly, in ways his atmospheric sensors confirmed were genuine amusement responses and not threat displays. He did not understand why the laughter made him feel, for the first time in his career, uncertain about how to proceed. He proceeded. His training was excellent, but the certainty was gone, and it did not come back. Marcus could walk by the time they came into the stadium. Not well. His legs were doing what legs do after circulation has been interrupted, numb, unreliable, prone to sudden failures of support, but walking. He'd pulled himself up using the railing on the ramp, the way 21,000 other people had already used railings in this stadium, and he was moving because there was somewhere he was trying to get. The med station, Section 127. He'd been a vendor here for 12 years and he knew where everything was, and he knew the med station had supplies, and there were people around him who needed supplies, and this was a thing he could do, so he was doing it. He wasn't alone. This is important. He was not a lone hero making a lone choice. He was one of perhaps 200 people in the stadium who, in the minutes after the second pulse, had identified something they could do and had started doing it. An off-duty paramedic who happened to be in Section 138. A man who turned out to be a structural engineer, making rapid visual assessments of the damaged sections of the upper deck. 3 women who had collectively run half a dozen disaster response trainings between them, and who found each other by accident and started organizing the people around them with quiet efficiency. A teenager who turned out to have a first aid kit in his backpack, because he always carried a first aid kit in his backpack, because his mother had told him to and he'd never questioned it, who distributed it one item at a time to whoever needed each specific piece. Not heroes. Just people doing what they knew how to do. The Valdhari forces entered the stadium through 3 gates simultaneously, 12 soldiers per gate, 36 total. They had done this before. The geometry of it was designed to be psychologically definitive, triangulated pressure, no escape corridor, visible authority at every point of the compass. They encountered people being helped to their feet. They encountered the paramedic from 138 working on a dislocated shoulder. They encountered the engineer completing an assessment and writing her conclusions on the back of a game day program with a borrowed pen. They encountered Marcus Webb walking toward the med station with his bad legs and his vendor's vest, and his 12 years of knowing exactly where everything was in this building. Senvorath, who had taken ground command, later wrote in his report that the humans in the stadium appeared to have not received information about their situation. He knew this was not correct, but he had no better explanation. They knew. He could see it in their postures, in the physiological data, in the expressions they turned toward his soldiers as the soldiers moved through the sections. He could see that they were afraid, genuinely afraid, with the chemical signatures of fear coming off them in amounts his sensors could quantify. They knew exactly what had arrived and what it meant. They were helping each other up anyway. One of his soldiers moved to intercept Marcus. Marcus stopped. I looked at the soldier. He was afraid. His heart rate was, by any measure, in a range his cardiovascular system would have objected to under other circumstances. His hands were not entirely steady. He was 41 years old with a bum shoulder and a forklift scar and 2 daughters he needed to get home to. He pointed to the med station sign, visible 40 feet away. The soldier looked at the sign, looked at Marcus. I looked back at the sign. Sen Vorath, watching, felt the uncertainty again, the same uncertainty from the parking lot, the same gap in his models that the parking lot had opened. He could process the armed resistance. He could process the panicked flight. He could process the stunned paralysis. He could not process the man with the yellow vest pointing at a medical sign with an expression that said, clearly, without translation needed, "There are people who need what is in there, and I am going to get it, and I would prefer you not stop me, but I am going to try regardless." The soldier didn't move. Marcus went to the med station. This would become, in the records of this event, the thing most often cited by the researchers who came afterward. Not a battle, not a heroic act of violence. A vendor pointing at a sign. A soldier failing to find a reason to stop him. A gap in authority that opened for 1 second and let something through. It opened 1,000 more times in the next hour. Every time a human did something with quiet purposefulness that didn't quite fit the category of resistance, but didn't fit the category of submission either. Every time someone helped someone else stand up. Every time someone kept a camera running or kept a signal alive or kept a generator going or made a decision to continue doing the thing they knew how to do, the gap opened. The protocol strained. The gaps accumulated. Veth Ashar received Prane's third message 20 minutes into the ground phase. It was longer than the previous ones. It took longer to read. It contained a phrase that Veth Ashar read 4 times and then set down and did not look at again for several hours, though she didn't stop thinking about it. They are not resisting the takeover. They are resisting the transformation into a subjugated species. These are different operations. We are equipped for the first. I do not know if our model addresses the second. The thing about 43 million people watching is that they do not stay watching. Some of them run. Of course they do. There is nothing wrong with running. Running is rational. Running is what survival looks like when survival is available. Thousands of people in the vicinity of cities with ships above them got in cars or on foot and went, and this was human too. This was real and right, and there is no shame in it. But some of them, a number that would take months to count, that would confound the counting, that kept being revised upward, some of them did what the parking lot had done, what the stadium had done, what Deja Patterson and Ahmed Sowery and Carl Hubbard and Marcus Webb had done without meeting each other or coordinating or choosing it as strategy. They stayed where they were. They kept doing what they knew how to do. They called each other. They checked on their neighbors. They kept generators running and water lines open and communication channels live. A radio host in Kansas City kept his show on the air for 11 hours straight, not because he had anything particular to say, but because silence felt like surrender, and he was not going to surrender to silence. A shift of nurses at a hospital in Philadelphia completed a full surgery under ships that had parked above the building and bathed it in the wrong light and the wrong pressure sound. Completed it because the patient was on the table, and the surgery was 3/4 done. And what else do you do with a patient on the table who is 3/4 through a surgery? You finish it. You finish it, and you note in your chart the unusual external circumstances, and you close and you monitor, and you do the next thing. They kept doing the next thing. The Valdhari subjugation protocol assumed a collapse point. Every species had one, a moment when enough had been demonstrated, enough had been shown, that the collective will of the population registered the futility of continuation, and the social structures redirected toward accommodation. Some species hit it quickly, some slowly. The Valdhari had engaged with a species that lasted longer than expected once before, and it had taken 3 weeks and significant resource expenditure, but the collapse point had come. 41 out of 41. They waited for it. It didn't come. What came instead was slower and stranger, and from the Valdhari's perspective, significantly more troubling. The collapse point didn't come because the humans weren't building toward a single moment of collective decision. They weren't a system with a central switch. Prane would write this in her final report, the one she would be asked to present to the full strategic command 7 months later. They were a distributed network of individual decisions that aggregated into continuity without requiring coordination. Every person who kept the water running was not doing it because command told them to. Every person who kept the lights on was not doing it because there was a general who ordered it. They were doing it because they were the person who knew how to do it and it needed doing, and they were still there. There were always still some of them there. The ships couldn't be everywhere. The suppression emitters had ranges, and humans in areas without suppression emitters were. The Valdhari learned this with growing unease, continuing to function, continuing to maintain the infrastructure, continuing to talk to each other and check on each other, and pass information and coordinate in the informal, redundant, structurally inefficient way that human societies had always coordinated, the way that was annoying and slow and wasteful, and apparently, catastrophically, unkillable. You could shut down a command structure. You could not shut down 43 million separate decisions to keep doing the next thing. Veth Ashar called her fleet commanders together on the 62nd day. She had not done this before at the 62-day mark of a subjugation. She had done it at the 18-day mark once, the 29-day mark twice, never later. She showed them the metrics. Infrastructure continuity, 67%, should have been below 15% at this point. Population compliance, 31%, should have been above 80% at this point. Psychological resistance indicators, the models they used to project the remaining timeline to full subjugation. The models were returning errors, not wrong numbers, errors. The kind of error a system returns when the values being input fall outside the range the model was designed to accommodate. One of her commanders asked what that meant. Veth Ashar thought about Prane's messages. She thought about the parking lot and the railings and the man with the vendor's vest. She thought about 11 seconds of silence followed by a chant. She thought about a radio playing a game broadcast while people lay on concrete floors with their legs disabled and laughed. She thought about Prane's phrase, "We are equipped for the first. I do not know if our model addresses the second." It means, Veth Ashar said, and she chose her words with care, that we have been measuring the wrong variable. We've been measuring when they decide to stop. We should have been asking, she paused, and something in her expression that was not quite fear and not quite respect settled into a configuration her officers had not seen on her face before, whether that is a question that has an answer. The room was quiet. Prane, who was the youngest person in the room, said, "Some of their historical texts describe it. The human concept, the idea that a thing is worth continuing specifically because continuing has cost something. That stopping would waste the cost. That the more it takes from them, the less they are willing to surrender it. They call it several things. The word that appears most consistently in their extreme instances is," she looked down at her notes though she had memorized it, "stubbornness. They consider it, depending on context, either a flaw or a form of love." No one spoke. "Their population is not traumatized into compliance," Prane continued. "Their population is being traumatized into cohesion. We have been running an extended press, and what we have achieved is the compression of 63 days of shared survival into a collective identity event that will likely outlast our entire presence on this planet. Veth Ashar stared at the metrics for a long time. "What is our recommended course?" one commander asked. It was the right question. It was also the question that had no good answer, because the math was what it was. Because 62 days of resource expenditure against a species that had not collapsed had already exceeded the projected cost-benefit threshold for subjugation, and the models projecting forward were all returning errors, and there was no clear endpoint visible in any direction that Veth Ashar could recommend with strategic confidence. She thought about Marcus Webb, whom she had watched on cameras for 62 days. Or rather, she had watched one feed among thousands, and he was one human among millions. But he had been in that first feed, the one from the ramp in section 114-115, and she had found him in subsequent feeds and watched him because she did not entirely know why, but she kept doing it. She had watched him help people stand up. She had watched him learn the locations of 3 other med stations after the first one ran low. She had watched him become something that the Valdhari had no category for, not a leader, not a soldier, not a symbol, just a person who kept finding the next useful thing and doing it day after day after day. In the building he'd worked in for 12 years, with legs that still weren't quite right from the second pulse, in a yellow vest that had become, in the feeds of whatever networks were still broadcasting, something that 43 million people recognized. He hadn't done anything special. He just refused to be done. She filed the withdrawal recommendation on day 63. It was the first withdrawal recommendation she had ever filed in 41 engagements. She would not tell anyone, not for a long time, about the thought that had crystallized for her in the hours before she filed it. The thought that had come from looking at the metrics and Prain's analysis, and the images from 62 days of footage of 68,000 people in a stadium who hadn't run, and 350 people in a parking lot who hadn't stood up, and one man in a yellow vest who'd pointed at a sign. The thought was this: the Valdhari had encountered species that could not be defeated militarily. They had encountered species with technology or physiology or organizational capacity that exceeded the Valdhari's own. Those species were difficult, and some had been left alone, and the calculation was always clear. This was different. This species was not militarily superior. They were not technologically superior. They did not have a defense that the Valdhari couldn't breach. They could be hurt. They could be suppressed. They could be physically subdued. They simply did not appear to contain, anywhere in their collective psychology, the thing that made subjugation work. Subjugation worked because species at some point performed the rational calculation. The cost of continued resistance exceeds the cost of accommodation, therefore, accommodation. It was not cowardice. It was not a weakness. It was logic. Every species with enough intelligence to be worth subjugating had enough intelligence to perform this calculation. Humans performed it. Individually, privately, quietly, Veth Ashar was sure of this. Her data confirmed it. Every human being in the data had performed this calculation. Millions of them had reached the rational answer. Thousands were still reaching it every day. And then they kept going anyway. Not because they'd made the wrong calculation. Because something in them, something she had no word for, something Prain had called stubbornness and called love and said was sometimes a flaw, something in them registered that the rational answer was not the only answer, that the cost of accommodation was real in ways the calculation didn't fully hold, that some things had a weight that numbers couldn't balance, that they could do the math and then refuse it. She had no strategic response to that. The Valdhari had been in space for a long time. They had been very successful for a long time. They had built a framework for the galaxy, and it was a good framework, an accurate framework, a framework that had processed 41 species. It did not have a field for this. The ships left on a Tuesday. Marcus was in section 127 when it happened. He was stacking supplies. They'd organized the med station into a proper distribution point over the last 2 months. Proper inventory, proper rotation schedule, nothing fancy. When the pressure frequency dropped, just stopped. Like a sound you hadn't consciously registered as constant until it was gone and the absence rang. He went out to the ramp. The sky was wrong in a different way now, the absence of the shadows, the return of actual light, the shadows going back to the shapes the shadows were supposed to be. One by one and then all at once, the ships were gone. He stood there for a while. People came out of the sections around him. Not running, not cheering, not yet. There would be cheering later, massive and prolonged and entirely earned. But right now, in this first moment, people just came out onto the ramps and looked at the sky together in silence. Not 11 seconds this time. Longer. Deja Patterson was 3 sections down with her phone up, streaming, saying nothing, just showing the sky. The broadcast truck was still running. Carl Hubbard had gone home once for 16 hours in week 4 to sleep and shower and then come back and not left again. His voice, when he finally spoke, was raw in a way that had nothing to do with 63 days of talking. He said, "They're gone." He didn't say anything else for a while. Marcus looked at the sky. Looked at the field below. The grass had grown through the entire 63 days. Untended, wild now, the yard lines obscured. He thought about his daughters. He thought about his oldest one's college fund. He thought about how much of the last 63 days he'd spent in this building, in this vest, doing this work, and how little of it had felt like heroism and how much of it had felt like just the next thing. The next thing that needed doing. The next person who needed help standing up. His legs still hurt. They probably always would a little. The doctors said the nerve damage from the second pulse might be permanent. He looked at the field and the wild grass and the wrong-lit sky becoming right again, and he thought about how it would be a long time before they played a game there again, and how eventually they would, and how he would probably still be working that day. 12 years becoming 13, becoming however many, selling beer on a ramp, knowing exactly where everything was. He thought that was all right. He thought that was, in fact, exactly right. Vetha Shar's withdrawal report was read by every strategic command in the Valdhari fleet. It was then transmitted to allied species and neutral observers in the region as protocol required. It circulated, the way significant documents circulate, further than intended. The section most often excerpted, most often discussed, was not the tactical analysis. It was not the resource expenditure breakdown. It was a single paragraph near the end, in a section labeled Notes on Psychological Profile, Caution for Future Operations, that Prane had drafted and Vetha Shar had approved with minor modifications. It read, "Recommend all fleet operations treat this species as a distinct category of engagement risk, separate from standard resistance classifications. The primary hazard is not military capability, organizational capacity, or technological sophistication. The primary hazard is this: the species does not appear to locate value and survival separately from what they survive as. Suppressing the body does not suppress the identity. Removing infrastructure does not remove the will to rebuild it. Demonstrating the futility of continuation does not produce the cessation of continuation. They continue. The mechanism by which they continue is not a military mechanism or a political mechanism. It is, as far as our analysis can determine, a cultural one, and it appears to be present in distribution across the population rather than concentrated in any targetable leadership or resistance node. We do not have a strategic counter to this. We recommend avoidance. Below this, in Vetha Shar's own notation, added after the report was filed, not part of the official record but preserved in the transmission, a single additional line: "They were playing a game when we arrived." I do not think they ever fully stopped. The galaxy, it turned out, had been watching too. Not all of it. Not the way 43 million people had watched. But the reports moved through diplomatic channels and intelligence networks, and the informal interstellar word of mouth that has always existed between spacefaring civilizations. And a picture assembled itself, slowly, the way pictures do when they're strange enough that no one wants to be first to describe them plainly. The picture was this. There was a species on a small planet around an unremarkable star. They were not particularly advanced. They were not particularly powerful. They had not demonstrated any capability that the galactic community would categorize as exceptional. They had no particular edge, no particular advantage, no particular destiny. They just hadn't stopped. And the Valdhari, who had stopped 41 species and had records going back further than most civilizations had been in space, had looked at them and done the math and filed a withdrawal recommendation. Not because humanity was the strongest thing in the galaxy, because somewhere in the models, in the calculus of how much it costs to hold a thing down versus how much the thing costs to continue holding, the numbers had come up wrong. Because 68,000 people in a stadium had refused to perform the expected behavior. Because a vendor in a yellow vest had pointed at a sign. Because 43 million people had watched and not looked away, and in not looking away had become something they hadn't been before the ships arrived. Something the ships, in their perfect mathematical planning, had created by accident. Something that remembered what it had kept going through. Something that would be remembered for a long time. Marcus Webb went home on a Tuesday. His youngest daughter met him at the door with the specific ferocity of a hug from someone who has been waiting 63 days to deliver it. He stood in his doorway and held on. His legs hurt. His back hurt. He smelled like 2 months of a stadium med station, which was not a smell he would recommend. He held on anyway. He was very good at that.